butchering your name, right? So, Professor Steenbergen is a full professor and vice dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Radboud University, the Netherlands. His work is defined by a strong connection between fundamental scientific research and real-world application in society. His expertise spans motor control, motor development, motor disorders, anything related to motors, apparently. So he is the member of the International Consensus Group of Developmental Coordination Disorders, and since 2017 he has led the interdisciplinary program called Active Living at Radboud University, a program that brings together research, education, collaboration with more than 20 societal and business partners. In 2018, the program received a prestigious NWA grant, which is a very prestigious grant in the Netherlands, for his trial project. So trial project stands for the Transition in Active Living Project. Professor Steenbergen research has been supported by grants totaling over 10 million euros. That's a lot of money, yeah, we can agree on that. He has published more than 200 research articles and 30 professional articles with an age index of over 50. Yeah, so we can really see his excellent history of work. So please join me in giving him a warm welcome. Please give him a big applause. Thank you, everyone. Today's lecture is titled Basic Motor Control and Learning. In his presentation, Professor Steenbergen will take us through a brief history of movement. We will then discuss motor control, including the many degrees of freedom within our movement system, and motor learning, covering the stages of motor learning, the role of attention across the stages, and as well as the feedback involved in motor learning and development. Well, I'm gonna be quiet, and without further ado, the stage is yours, Professor Steenbergen.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice introduction. It sets the bar really high. And just to be sure, the 10 million euros that I got, it's all for research, so there's no money for me involved in it. So that's a pity. Welcome everybody on this lecture on motor control and learning. You said I'm from the Netherlands. I don't know if all of you know where the Netherlands is. It's a tiny country actually in Europe. So a country is like, I think 350 kilometers in length and 150 kilometers in width. So it's a very small country, but we're with 80 million people, so we're with a lot of people. So it reminds you a bit of Jakarta, because it's also pretty busy here. So, well. So what I normally do, if I sometimes have to teach for classes like 400 students, and it's always difficult to get everybody involved, and that everybody is quiet. You don't have to be really quiet if you want to talk something. That's okay. But what I normally do at the start of the lecture is just do. And then everybody's like, okay, what is he saying? And then everybody's quiet. So that's a good way of getting large groups really quiet. What I'm going to do today, because I learned that you're all first year students, so you probably don't know a lot about motor control and motor learning, which is good for me, of course, because then I can teach you something that you don't know. It's nice to be a lecturer to teach people things they don't know. I will talk a little bit about motor control and motor learning. I will lead you through the whole process. And if you have any questions, just raise your hand or shout or whatever, and I'm more than happy to answer the questions. We can also do a Q&A afterwards, but I'd rather have you to ask questions. Sometimes I can talk a little bit quick, especially if I'm talking in Dutch, which I don't do, but if I'm talking English, I can also go a little bit quick. So sometimes if you don't understand things that I'm saying or things that I'm explaining, just raise your hand and I can explain it again. That's no problem. Okay, so let's get started. I have to put my, oh yeah, I'm looking there. my lecture, I have a couple of topics that I want to discuss today. First one is movement registration. So if you want to, it's also in psychology. If you study psychology, you study behavior. But one of the important things is then, okay, how do you register behavior? With motor control, it's the same. So how do you register motor control? How do you register movements? I will talk a little bit about that, also the history of that and where we're at now. And then I get to the two main parts, that's motor control and motor learning. And at the end I will combine them and also talk about feedback. And also in the context of sport and exercise, what can you do as a trainer or coach. Okay, let's start with movement registration. Does anybody know this person? Probably not personally, because he already died. But so this is Edward Muybridge, and I'm not teaching a history lesson here. But Edward Muybridge was a famous photographer in his time. He's I don't think this one works, but he's on the left side there, and he was very interested in movement. But of course, being a photographer, you only make static pictures. So you make a picture, but there's no movement. So he thought, okay, how can I get it to work that I can register movements? And what he did was very, very smart. So he built a system, and it's all in here. So in that little shed, there were like, I think 20 cameras, all next to each other. And what he did, he made pictures just after each other. Just all the pictures after each other. After that, he used this machine. It's called the zoopraxiscope. I've never heard of it, but it's in that time it was a very fancy tool. And nowadays we all have cameras on the mobile and this and that. But this was the first person who did movement registration. So what turns out is that you had movements like the one on the right, top right. So these are basically a collection of all the different photos that he made. And in that way, he could register movements. So he had a lot of photos, he made a lot of photos, and via this projection, you get movements like this. And actually, the story goes, but I'm not sure if that's true. The story goes that Edward Muybridge had a sort of a bet with a friend with him, and his friend said, okay, if you have a horse, and the horse can either walk, trot, or gallop, and he said, if a horse is galloping, does he leave all four legs from the floor? And of course, that's an empirical question. And Muybridge said, well, I could probably solve it. I'll just make the recordings, and then I'll see if the four legs are from the floor. And you can see on the top right or on the lower right, you can see that the horse is leaving the floor. So this is one of the very, very first known historical people that have been using movement registration. Nowadays we have much more sophisticated movement registration. I don't know, you probably don't know, but what kind of movement registration do you have here in psychology? Do you know that? No? Okay, so to go back at Muybridge, so these were very coarse, broad kind of movements. There are two systems that are currently very sophisticated and that people use to do movement registration. One of those is OptoTrack, and you see it there. And on the top, on the bottom left, you see all these markers. So that these are the markers, these ones. And you basically put them on your body, for instance here or on your finger or whatever, or on your knee, whatever you want to register. And these markers, they send out red infrared light, so light that you can't see. But the light is picked up by the system which is over there, and that's this system, the sensor system. And this movement registration is extremely precise. So you can actually register movements up to, I think, 4,000 hertz. So that's 4,000 times a second you can register the position of one of those IRADs. So you can imagine if you do a reconstruction afterwards with movements, that it's really, really precise. Octatrack is used a lot in basic motor control experimental work, and it's an expensive system, but it's very, like I said, very precise. And you can see it set up, experimental setup here. So you see participant with an IRAD here, and basically this is very basic, registering pointing movements. And what you see then is here, so if you make a velocity profile of the wrist, so you have the IRAD on the wrist, and you move towards an object, then if you do the velocity profile, so the speed of the wrist, it's very simple. You start by 0, you speed up, you reach a top, and then you decelerate, and the deceleration is of course because you don't want to bump into the object you're pointing to. You can also look at the opening of the hand, so if you put an IRAD here and an IRAD there, you can see the opening of the hand and the closing of the hand. Is that clear? This is a very simple example on how to use Octatrack. These days, well, people are completely full of all the markers, and you can see the complete body movements and those kind of things. So it's much more sophisticated than this. Another system that is often used, also in rehabilitation, is the Viking system. So remember, with the Octatrack, the markers, they send out infrared light. So they're what they call active markers. Here, you have passive markers. So these are these markers, and they basically, you have a video system that picks up the light from these, the reflected light from these markers. The great advantage of this system is because you have passive markers, you don't need wires and all those kind of things. So you can basically put up markers on the whole body. This one is often used in rehabilitation. The setup looks a little bit like this. So you have a lot of cameras. The person is standing here, making all kinds of movements, as you can see here, for instance, with hands. And then you see the analysis and movement registration on the screen. It's even used in kangaroos, I know, from studies in Australia. And I don't know how many of you play games with avatars, but often those playing, there's all females, most females, so I don't know how many of you play FIFA, I think FIFA 6 or 7. So who's playing it?
Iya, tapi pemilih ganti ya.
Okay, must be European. So FIFA is a soccer game that you can play on the Xbox or Nintendo or something. And you can choose teams. You can play against each other. It's very nice to do. It takes up a lot of time though. And if you look at the movement of those players, you think, I think that's Ronaldo, or that's Messi. And actually, they are Ronaldo and Messi because what the game developers did, they had Messi and Ronaldo in a lab with a suit on with all the markers, and they had to make the soccer movements. And based on those movements, based on that registration, they made an avatar. So basically, Ronaldo as an avatar, and they used that in the FIFA game. And there's a lot of games actually out there that use sort of expert performers to make the movements as realistic as possible. So again, this is very much used in rehabilitation also. Is that clear? If there are questions, just raise your hand. Okay, so that's about movement registration. Like I said, if you all study behavior in psychology, and you can imagine also, for instance, clinical psychology, you need to know, okay, but what do I call behavior, so typical behavior, and what is abnormal behavior? And you have to, one way or another, you have to register, and you have to score, and you have to have objective registration. Okay, so that's for with respect to the registration techniques. Now we come to motor control. So this is basically core of my lecture. What is motor control? And it doesn't have anything to do with all the motorcycles that you see here on the screen. Motor control is basically controlling your movements and movements in the real world. This is an older neurophysiologist. So, like I said, it's not a history lesson. But it's always good to know where we originated from. And Nikolai Bernstein was a Russian neurophysiologist. And he said basically the whole problem of motor control is learning how to control your many degrees of freedom. And this is a rather abstract concept, and I will dig into it a little bit later. But he said basically you have a movement system with a lot of degrees of freedom. And in order to make movements, you need to, one way or another, control these many degrees of freedom. Nowadays, so Bernstein was from the 19th century. In those days, we didn't have MRI, all those brain scanning techniques, so we didn't know too much about what the brain is capable of. We know that now, that the brain is capable of a lot of things. So it's a little bit of a different story now. But for Bernstein, this was the basic problem of motor control. So controlling your degrees of freedom. How do you do that? I like basketball a lot, so Michael Jordan is probably before your time, but he played at the Bulls. He was a phenomenal basketball player, and if you see him move, it's really an elite mover, and well, you're amazed how he can move his body. So there is a difference between, of course, a novice, or somebody who's starting to move, like a little baby, or an expert player like Jordan from the Chicago Bulls. And here it's just a sort of graphical display. Okay, so how do you control it? Is there sort of a brain on top of it, or a hand on top of it that controls the whole system? Or how is that possible? The degrees of freedom is a sort of abstract concept, maybe. If you look at our body, we have over 100 joints. So that's a lot. If you only look at the finger, how many joints are in there, it's extremely much. They have to be controlled. If you go a little bit further, this guy has just as much muscle that we have, only he's trained a little bit more, but we have a lot of muscles. We have over 750 muscles in our body. Only the face, I don't know how much, but the face has a lot of muscles, which makes it possible to do all the different facial expressions. So the face is basically a very extraordinary system in terms of muscle control. And if you go a little bit further, a little bit deeper into the system, so then you get the motor units. So these are the muscles within the muscles, and the motor units are basically the core elements of movements. And there are over 10,000 motor units. So you can imagine controlling all these things is extremely difficult. And then, like I said, Bernstein said it's a logical problem. So it's just a problem of how do we control it. Like now we know that brain can do a lot, but there's other ways to do it. Okay, so what did Bernstein suppose or propose for the solution of the degrees of freedom? He said, first stage, what you do is you couple parts of your movement. So, and that's a very rigid solution. So he said some of those degrees of freedom are basically frozen. And with frozen we mean you just lock them. So if you, for instance, tennis is always a nice way of giving a good example. If you see somebody starting to learn tennis, then it goes, we call it, it's very rigid. So it's like this. So you move basically the whole body. So basically what you do is you're only controlling the swing of your body. Because you're freezing basically your elbow, your shoulder, so you don't have to control those movements. So then you basically reduce your degrees of freedom in order to have a controllable system. So you only control this. So that's in the beginning, that's easy. But then of course, if you proceed, for instance with this little guy learning tennis, if you proceed, you release more and more of those degrees of freedom and take them into control. So you can, for instance, think of moving your elbow a little bit more, or maybe moving your shoulder more, maybe using your feet in a different way. So that's the second stage that Bernstein proposed. In the third stage, then you're an elite player. So these are the really elite, in this case, elite tennis players. And you can actually use your whole body to make the movement. And also you can adjust the movements very quickly. For instance, when there are elastic forces that are there, and you have to sort of adjust it, and you can basically do that. So is that clear? So basically, if you go from the very start, so somebody who's starting to learn to move, to somebody who's an elite mover, so to speak, you increase your degrees of freedom, so you leave them out of control, and then you gradually more and more use those degrees of freedom in control. You can also see that with young children that start to learn to walk. They walk very rigidly, and well, it's easy that they fall over because they walk so rigidly, and later on, if you all come in here, you're all good walkers, so then you're much more flexible with each other. Okay, then there's an important thing between being a novice, so freezing your degrees of freedom, and being elite. And that is with respect to flexibility and the trade-off between flexibility and controllability. As I said, the start of the movement, you're very rigid, so you only use a couple of degrees of freedom of your body. So you're not exploiting the complete potential of your body, but you're only using part of it. That's easy to control, or easier to control, but you're not very flexible. And if you're more and more expert, then the control becomes a little bit easier, but you're also much more flexible. And I can give an example of that. So this is our Dutch. This is a big supermarket chain. Albert Heijn is called in Holland. I don't know if the chain is here. Anyway, so a shopping cart. I haven't seen those. They're here. Shopping cart. Yeah. Okay, so suppose you're in a grocery store, and you want to do shopping, then you have a shopping cart. And the grocery stores are usually, that's a business model, they have very tight alleys, because they want to stock as many produce in the shop as possible. So the alleys are the way you can maneuver through, are very tight. So you need a system that is extremely flexible, and a shopping cart is extremely flexible. It's got 4 wheels that can move independently. So mind you, these are only 4 degrees of freedom. I showed you previously, if you look at the human body, we have extremely much muscles, but these are only 4 degrees of freedom. So that's a very simple, sounds like a very simple movement system. So what is good about shopping carts is that the movement of these 4 wheels, they are independent of each other. So basically, if you're in a narrow alleyway in a shopping market, and you want to go to the straight forward, but you want to turn to the right, you can just go to the right, because the shopping cart allows it, because the 4 wheels can just turn, and they allow it. So this is a system that has maximum control, because you can move, you can go backwards, forwards, left, right, very easy. The only problem is, I know men do shopping. I always have problems with the shopping carts because they always go directions that you don't want to go. So the control is sometimes a bit odd because the wheels they have a life on their own, and sometimes you think, oh, I want to go right, but then the wheels go left, and that's okay. So maximum flexibility, control is okay, but not very good. Then the other one is if you, for instance, have a high-speed sports car, it's the same idea. So 4 degrees of freedom, there are 4 wheels. And how do they, but you can't control those 4 wheels independently if you're on a highway. That would be very dangerous. So what you can see there is what they did with the real wheels is basically what Bernstein proposed. So it's a very inflexible solution, but it's a first solution. So you basically take those 2 wheels out of control. So you just fixate them, so they can only roll. You can't steer them, they're just there. The other thing, what they did, is couple the rear wheels. So basically, you have degrees of freedom, you have 4 degrees of freedom. The rear wheels you just fixate, so you leave them out of control. And the front wheels you couple. So you're only left with 1 degree of freedom. And that's for these kind of cars, of course, for every car, it's a very usable system because you can basically use your steering wheel to control the car at high speed. I don't know what speed is allowed here, but we live close to Germany. In Germany, there's highways where you can, some places you can just go as fast as you like. So it's good to have a very controllable car, I can tell you. But this solution is very, very smart, of course, because you control, couple the front wheels, you only need your steering wheel to control your car. So basically, as with the shopping cart, you instigate things to the degrees of freedom by which you can control the car. So here, the 4 degrees of freedom are basically reduced to 1, and 1 is controlled by the steering wheel. Is that clear? So that's, if you go back to human motor control, that's the same what you see with people who have to learn new movements. They basically do the same. Sometimes they fixate parts of the body, like with the tennis player, they only move their body. Sometimes they couple different limbs of the body, etc. Okay. So there is if you're gaining control, motor control, then of course the idea of bursting was, okay, you go to a first stage where you use your degrees of freedom, and you go a little bit further, and at the end you use all your degrees of freedom. But this is a very conceptual model. Years later, Fitz and Posner in 1967, they proposed the stage model of Moderator. And this is a quite influential model even nowadays in human motor control. And they basically said what happens if you learn new movements, you go through 3 stages. The first stage is the verbal cognitive stage. It's the very first stage of learning. So remember again, for instance, if you want to learn a new skill like cycling or something, so how many of you do cycle to university? What stupid question, though. So walking? Some of you. You all take a car? Train? Train. Okay. So there's not a lot of movement involved there. But I can tell you, well, you know that as well, that in the Netherlands we all take a bike. It's also not so hot as it is here, so it's also the climate that is a little bit more gentle if you want to do cycling. So we all learned to cycle when we were really young, so probably 3 years or so, and then we were already 3-4 years were able to cycle independently. But cycling is quite it's difficult to learn actually, and once you know it, it's pretty easy. With cycling also, if you take that as an example, when you first start to learn to cycle, so you go through the first stage, it's the verbal cognitive stage, and there's a lot of cognitive effort involved in you to learn to cycle. You need to know how to pedal, you need to know how to retain your balance and all those kind of things. And what you gain a lot there is verbal instruction. So if somebody explains to you, okay, you have to do this and then you have to do that, then that helps a lot. But at the same time, of course, because it costs you so much cognitive effort, there's not much effort or not much capacity left to perform the movement. So you see that the cognitive processes are very dominant in this phase. And you can imagine if you have, you only have a limited amount of cognitive resources. So if you need to devote a lot of cognitive researches or attention to the movement itself, there's not much left to perform the movement itself. So what you do then is, what I said in the beginning, you freeze some of the wheel in order to perform the movement. If if you go a little bit further, that's the associative motor stage. That's the second stage that Fitz and Posner introduced. Then the attention is not so much at the motor control itself or the motor performance itself, but it's more the refinement of the motor control. So in the case of cycling, you already know a little bit how to cycle, but you refine your skill. So you get better at cycling. In the autonomous stage, which is the final stage of learning, then your movement control is basically automatic. So if you look at the people in the Netherlands, all the students, most of them take the cycle to the university. They're all very, you could say elite cyclists because they can cycle very, very well. In this autonomous stage, you don't need a lot of cognitive effort anymore for controlling the movements. So basically, you can use your attention or your cognitive resources to do something else. For instance, talk to the person next to you who is cycling. So basically, your motor capacity is so automatic that you don't need any cognitive effort to do it. You can basically do it with your eyes closed, and then you can do it so automatically that it just runs off. Is that a little bit clear? So there's a shift from, in the beginning, a lot of cognitive and attentional resources going into the motor control. And if you gradually go to more elite stages, or you're becoming more proficient in the motor skill, your cognitive resources can be used for something else than the motor control itself, because it's automatic. I have here, but I don't show it here. So what that is, that also has implications for if you're, for instance, a trainer or a coach in movement control, then it's very interesting because as a trainer coach, of course, you want to know, okay, how do I learn my pupil to make the motor skills as good as possible, for instance, basketball or volleyball or swimming or whatever. In this first stage, the sporter is very much helped by instructions, very much verbal instructions. So instructions on how to do the movement, so how to perform the movement. So what motor skills do I need to do? How do I move my arm? How do I move my leg, etc. And then you can, as a trainer, you can also say, okay, well, I sort of temporarily fixate parts of the movement. They do that, for instance, in swimming. If you start learning to swim, and then you all learn to swim when you're very young, because there's a lot of water. It's pretty safe if you know how to swim. So what they do at the beginning, you're swimming, and then they fixate your legs. There's a sort of a floater, so you can basically put your legs on there. So you don't have to use your legs, and you float. So the only thing you have to take care of is the movements of your arms. So then that way you can learn how to swim. And in the beginning, then when I was young, I'm not a very good swimmer, but then the teacher tells you a lot about how to move your arms, basically how to move your arms in parallel with each other, and that helps you a lot by with performance. If you go a little bit further in the associative stage, then you can imagine, for instance, sports like gymnastics or something, and then the coach is very much attuned to refinement of skills, so gives you information about how the movement was performed and how it can be improved. And finally, in the autonomous stage, especially in sports skills, it's more on tactic. So remember again, in the autonomous stage, you're an elite sporter or an elite mover, and you know already what to do. It doesn't take a lot of cognitive effort. So then you can basically focus on what your opponent is doing, for instance in tennis, for instance in basketball, you can look at tactics, all those kind of things. So then you can devote more attention to things that are outside your basic knowledge. Is that a little bit clear? Is there any questions? Just ask. Okay, just take some more. Then the effects of attention in different stages. That's a really interesting one. Like I said at the beginning, you need a lot of attention while performing the motor skill. Later on, that attention is sort of freed because you don't need it for your motor skill per se anymore. And that's something very interesting what happens there. So I'll talk you through it. So suppose you're a novice. So what is a good example? Is motor skill walking maybe? What is the most common sport here in Indonesia? Badminton. Okay. Okay. And okay, let's start with it because then I have an example that because otherwise I have all the cycling examples and you're like, oh yeah, that's your example. So I'll do it with badminton. Maybe that's better. I don't know a lot about that. I know how it's played. Not that I'm good at it, but I know what skill involves. So suppose let's call myself a novice. So I'm not very good at it. Suppose I'm trying to learn badminton. Then if I play badminton and I have a coach that tells me task relevant information, so I'll just go here. So that's this one here. So the attention is pretty much on the task itself, on the badminton itself. So if I have a coach that says, oh no, you have to raise your arm better, or you have to, like I said, I don't know much about badminton, but probably I said, you have to do this or that, let's put it that way, nicely abstract, then it doesn't interfere with the skill. It actually helps me a lot because I get instructions about how to do it, and I need that instruction being a novice player. I need a lot of instruction on how to actually make my movements. But then, task irrelevant information, so if the same coach I'm trying to learn badminton, and the same coach stays next to me and starts talking about the weather or whatever irrelevant things. Then it interferes with my skill because I have to think about that, and then I can't devote any attention to my badminton skill, to develop my badminton skill. So task relevant, so being a novice, task relevant information is very useful. And also coaches, but also if you're if you're a physiotherapist or an occupational therapist, trying to relearn movements with children, for instance, with old people that have a stroke. You need task relevant information, so you need to provide information about the task itself, so how to do the movements, where to pay attention to, etc. Task irrelevant information is interfering then with the basic motor skill, because the patient or the mover needs all his attention to the movement and cannot devote any resources, any cognitive resources to other things than the motor control. But suppose, so who's a pro here in badminton? Nobody. Okay, so here's the pro. So now, so you're in the autonomous stage. So you do it without effort. So suppose that I give you task relevant information, then it's really difficult because you're such a pro that your movements are basically in a different memory system. I won't go into detail there, but it's a different memory system, and it's very difficult to get access to the memory system. If I can give you task relevant information and say, oh, you have to do this or that, then it basically can interfere with your movement. So it's very good to know. But if I give you task irrelevant information, so for instance you play badminton, and I just talk with you, you can still play badminton because you're in the autonomous state, and it's very easy to do. So there is a sort of, you might call a flip of the coin here. So in the beginning, task relevant information extremely useful. Task irrelevant information interferes with your basic motor task. If you're a pro, if you're doing like walking, for instance, everybody who's here, I saw everybody walking in, and everybody can walk very efficiently. So the walking of all of you is in the autonomous stage. If I ask you, how do you walk? How do you bend your knee? How do you raise your ankle? All this kind of thing. You're like, okay, how do I do that? And then it actually interferes with your walking. If I talk to you basically about other stuff, you can just walk, because most of you came in here walking, so I suppose you're all in the autonomous state. Okay, a little bit more about this. So just another example, which might help. So how many of you drive a car? Not many? So who has a driver's license? Maybe I should ask this. Okay, some of you have, but most of you, it's correct that most of you don't yet have a driver's license. Well, anyway. Doesn't matter. So suppose, so let's say that half of you, just for the sake of argument, let's say that half doesn't have a driver's license, that half does have a driver's license. That's a bit easier to explain. So if you don't have a driver's license, suppose you have your first driving lesson. You're a bit anxious, of course, because the car, how do I manage the car? And the car is sort of, you can look at it as a sort of motor control, because you have to steer, you have to adjust the speed, you have to change gears if you don't drive an okay car. So suppose your group is the first lesson, and your driving instructor is sitting next to you. Then, and you're a bit anxious, of course, then if you get information on how to manage the steering wheel, how to manage your speed pedal, how to manage the clutch if you don't drive one minute, that really helps you. That really helps you to sustain the motor car and basically get your driver's license at the end. If that guy next to you, or girl next to you, say, is talking about a lot of things in your first driver's lessons, for instance, again about weather or about a soccer game or whatever, then you being anxious, it doesn't help you anything with your driving. So he's saying, but the task relevant information doesn't interfere, actually helps you. The task irrelevant information doesn't help you, because you need to devote your attention to driving and to managing all those freedom. So the other group, who was very proficient in driving, they have the driving license already for, say, 10 years or so. Not 10 years, but a couple of years. So you're very proficient in driving. So suppose that the same instructor is now hitchhiking. I don't know if that's allowed here in Indonesia. Suppose he's hitchhiking and you're driving by with your driving license, the car, and you think, that's a pity, but I can take the with. And then you take him with you, and he's sitting next to you, and then you're talking, you're chit-chatting about all kinds of things, and it doesn't interfere with your basic control. So this is the task irrelevant information, because you're a pro in driving, so you don't need attention for driving. But now suppose the person next to you, the instructor says, remember, I taught you how to drive. Do you still remember how to do the clutch, how to do the steering wheel, and how to change gears and this and that? Then it actually interferes. Because this skill, this motor skill, is now so automatic that's in your long-term memory system, and it's difficult to get that back in your conscious control, and it interferes with your driving. So that's basically the whole flipping of the coin between if you're a novice or a pro. So attention is extremely important, or not attention, the type of attention is extremely important related to the skill level that you have. And you can imagine being, for instance, and this holds for a lot of contexts, because, for instance, being a rehabilitation doctor, it's also important, for instance, if you're having a person in the clinic with a stroke, so with brain injury, a person who wants to regain balance again, because mobility is always the first thing that they try to regain. So they're walking on a treadmill, and then if this person that just had a stroke has to relearn motor skills like walking, then you as a rehab doctor or physiotherapist or occupational therapist has to give a lot of attention about the skill itself. So how should they place their feet, how should they move their arms, all those kind of things. what you shouldn't do as a clinician is talk about irrelevant things, because this patient needs all his attention to walking. So that applies for a lot of, it's also the children that learn skills. It applies for a lot of things, sports skills. So this is very important to know. It's also important to know at what level, what skill level somebody is. So if, for instance, with cycling, some people in there, well, most people in there can cycle pretty well, but children, they can't cycle well. And what you, for instance, see, it's always very funny. I have with my children as well. So if we try to get children to cycle, we go to a park and there's grassy field, we have a small bike, child on a bike, give it a big push, and then we hope that they're going to cycle. And sometimes they fall up, and that's okay because you're in class. That's how they learn. Now suppose that your child can just cycle, so is able to cycle a little bit, and you're walking next to the child. That's what you see a lot happening in the parks in the Netherlands. If you know it, you can see it. Let's put it that way. And then the parents are so happy that the child is cycling, so they start talking, how funny, how nice, and how good of you. And then the child falls over, because then the child has to devote its attention to the happy parent, and then he cannot devote any attention anymore to the motor control itself. So then they fall over. So that's, I mean, it's not a problem, but that's the whole idea about not being knowledge when being released. I'm just looking at the time. I think should we take a break for? Do you have any questions about this? Well, maybe during the break you can digest it a bit and then. Oh, there's one question.
My question is in my experiences to have a psychological counseling and coaching in a pro athlete. Sometimes we have to make innovation in a way, in a technique and skills. Yeah. Is it true that it's a little bit hard to change something that maybe from the age of the childhood until teenager, they play like doing this, and it's not just only technique, because in badminton, right now I'm in badminton. I saw three aspects. First is technical, then physically, and the third is mentally. So, what is the relevant or irrelevant matter that we must talk to have little bit change the way they play, because sometimes if there is no change, so the situation is still remain and we have no good progress.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good one, because that's what you see a lot with elite sportsmen. So sometimes, and also, so what's a good example? So for instance, gymnastics, that's a good example. So they learn the work a certain way in which they have to perform the gymnastics. And then all of a sudden they say, well, that's not good enough, because if you want to make the triple somersault or whatever you want to say, you have to use another technique. And that's extremely difficult, because then in this case, so in the elite sporters like the gymnastics, they already have that in their long-term memory system, and it's sort of in a motor memory already. So first thing you have to do is to get that out, and that sounds very simple, but you have to devote attention again to the movement, and then basically sort of tease down all the movement parts, and then sit down with, or not sit down, but tell the sporter, okay, so how do we do it? What do we do now? What and then you sort of, what you're trying to do there is to sort of uncouple this whole movement. So basically you try to let go of the movement that they already did, because then they get very conscious knowledge about the movement, and then I do it this way and that way. And then, but that's a very, how do you call it, very tricky one, because then you have to try to learn the new skill. And then you have to, again, devote attention to that and say, okay, now we did that and that. That's not good, this part we're going to skip. But again, also there, you have to sort of, that has a lot to do with individual freedom. You have to sort of cut down the pieces of the skill and say okay, what parts of the skill do we want to remain? So what parts of the skill good, so to say, also new technique, and what parts do we get rid of? And then it's also a matter of training, rehearsing over and over again. But it's a good one, and it's a very difficult one, because I know a lot of elite sporters that need to learn a new way of moving or a new skill. Sometimes it takes up to a year and a half. For instance, with tennis, if they want to do a different volley or a different serve, that takes so many training. So it's a difficult one. But you have to, I think, in that case, what you sometimes see is that they look at the technique as it is done already, and then they make it very explicit. So basically, they go to the task relevant information in the autonomous state. So basically, they say, okay, now what are you doing, so to speak, and then try to disentangle it and try to get out the good bits, train on the good bits, and add on to those good bits. That's a way to do it.
Yeah, sometimes it's a matter of how they feel confidence. How they feel confident. For example, my skater, she knows how to jump in a vehicle. But she afraid because she had experience. She fell down and that made a little bit trauma. And then it's quite difficult to assure her that it's okay. You have to be great at that. But it's not quite simple.
Now, and maybe in addition to that, what they sometimes also do is use things like motor imagery. So basically, that they say, okay, imagine yourself doing that movement. That's also, but that's a very different one. And the other thing is to use videos. So use videos of, you can use AI, for instance, for that. So say, okay, I want to do this movement, and then have them look at that, and then imagine themselves, like, okay, what should it feel kinesthetically if I do that movement? So that all helps, but it's very difficult. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
You got 10 minutes?
Oh, there's a question. Okay, not yet.
Thank you for the chance for asking, sir. So I have a question related to the autonomous stage of in-motor learning. So based on my experience, for example, when I'm riding a motorcycle or car, sometimes I feel like I'm not fully aware of what I'm doing, and suddenly I already arrived at my destination. Could you explain why that happens? Is it because the skill has reached the autonomous stage, and where attention is no longer fully required? Yeah, that's my question.
That's a nice one, because I don't drive a motorcycle, but I cycle. I sometimes have, when I cycle, I mean, if you're very proficient in it, you don't usually have your earphones. Sometimes you text, don't do it. I mean, it's forbidden, but you can have something to do. And then I have the same experience. So you're cycling, and then all of a sudden you think, oh, I'm there. And even without the interesting thing of that, that happens to you as well, but you're taking a left turn, right turn, without even thinking about it. You just go with the flow. And I think actually that's a very good example of that you're really in the autonomous state. So basically you do it, so it's sort of in your memory system, long-term memory. You just do it, and the attention that you have is for something else, like daydreaming or thinking about, well, where are you going to eat, or those kind of things. And then I think it's a perfect example of being in the autonomous states, that the skill itself, the maneuvering with the motorcycle, doesn't cost you any energy, so you don't need to think about it. And then you have cognitive resources to think about other things. So that's a good example.
Thank you, sir.
Questions?
Oh, yeah, that's okay. Yeah.
Thank you for the chance, sir. I want to ask about the technical stages of learning. If a professional hasn't done action for a long time and they're trying to gain their mastery skills, does that mean they're back at the novice level, or is there any other explanation to that?
So can you repeat that?
Yes.
I think I missed it.
Okay, so if a professional hasn't done an action for a long time and they forget about it and they're trying to regain their mastery, does that mean they're back to the novice level and trying to reach their potential before, or are there any other explanation to that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because that's a difficult one to answer. Sort of difficult. So one example of that might be, for instance, what I told you with stroke. So suppose people get a stroke, and mostly people that are older get a stroke. And so before the stroke, people can walk. So suppose that that's a professional level, like autonomous stage. And then they get a stroke, and then they have to relearn the whole process of walking. It's not the case that they're back to square one, so back to the very first stage. Well, in a sense they are, but they learn very quick, because there's also something like a motor memory system or muscle memory system. And basically that's still there, but has to be activated again. And what you see, for instance, with people with a stroke, they have to start over all over again. So they have to walk on a treadmill, sometimes supported by that they don't fall over. And then the medical doctor can help them, can actually give them information about it. But then regaining the skill there goes a little bit fast. And they, of course, they never, well, depends a bit on the person. Not always able to walk again independently. But the interesting thing there, if I may, a bit more, so it goes a little bit faster, but then what you see, for instance, with all people with stroke, so they do rehabilitation in the clinic, and they walk on a treadmill, they can walk, and then they go walking in a laboratory, which is now complete, and nothing like before, and they can walk, and it goes very well. But I once read a very nice article, and the title was like people with stroke walking when talking. That was the title. Basically what they said is, okay, so when you're a rehabilitation doctor and there is a person with stroke, and you did a rehabilitation walking, so they can walk, you think, they're in the autonomous state because they can walk. But like you, that's in the ideal situation of the lab. So good lighting, not a lot of noise, nothing on the floor, no obstacles on the floor. And then the study was about, okay, what happens if you start walking? And then you can actually see that some people are not in the autonomous state because they can walk and they devote a lot of attention to their walking. But as soon as there's something happening, a noise or somebody starts to talk to them, then they stop. That was the time of the article. They stop walking because the walking already still takes a lot of effort. So it's not in the autonomous state. And that's also the whole dual. I don't know if you've ever heard of dual tasking. But that's always a nice way. Dual tasking is a nice way to find out if people are in the autonomous stage or not. So again, about the cognitive effort you use when you're in the beginning. So if you're in the autonomous stage, you don't need a lot of cognitive effort, like the example that you gave. But if you're not yet in the autonomous stage, you can't do anything besides doing motor control. So that's what we call dual tasking. So if you want to know, for instance, if this patient with stroke is already in the autonomous stage because he's walking or not, the very simple thing to do is just walk next to the person, start talking to him, start talking about everything, basically, and then see if his walking is effective or not. So if you, I mean, you all came in here walking and were chatting, but it didn't affect your walking, so you're all in the autonomous stage. But I bet you, if you have a person that just had a stroke and did a rehabilitation, is able to walk again, starts walking inside here and starts talking, you will probably stop. So that gives you information about what stage the person is in. And it's also for a trainer coach, important information to have. So where in this, say, novice to elite stage is somebody? Little long answer.
Hi, I just have a question regarding the solution according to industrial designers of motor control. So you mentioned that shock card has 4 degrees of freedom and the control is not very good, but a supercar with only 1 degree of freedom has maximum control. So is there an inverse proportion to, so like does less degrees of freedom mean more control, or are there more classes to it? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, I mean there is this trade-off between controllability and flexibility. I think it's more. So this was just an example to show that only 4 degrees of freedom are already difficult to transfer whether there's more degrees of freedom. I don't think it's a one-to-one, but in a lot of cases it is the case that if you degree or if you reduce your degree of freedom, you're only at 1 or 2 to control, then it goes at the expense of flexibility. And I think designers can actually make use of it, and that's what you see in shopping cars. Because you can also say, well, I make a shopping car with, well, it's the same as with a car, so fix the rear wheels and just have one couple of the front wheels. But that's not going to maneuver very well in the shopping car. And actually, a lot from big trucks, big lorries, so also cars, some cars actually have that. So basically, that's a design. So it's always difficult to park your car. I can imagine it's here, there's no parking spots. Parking spots are very narrow. But some cars, actually, especially big cars, is that you can actually have that release your rear wheels, so they can also pick up and that's very easy to so these are all designers. Does it answer your question?
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you so much for the questions. I think we're ready for a break for 10 minutes. So we'll return and start again at 10:50. Thank you.
yesterday I walked into the big shopping mall. There's on the floor, if you enter there, there's a big playground. That's all implicit learning. The kids just run in there and just play. And nobody's instructing them, okay, you have to do this and that. So it's much more fun. Okay. So explicit learning, I already explained before. Great. Implicit learning, there's different ways in which you can do implicit learning. One very often used way is learning by observation. So basically, video imaging or those kind of things. You're basically not explaining a person what to do, but you show them a movie of how somebody does it. And that's very, especially in sports science, it's a very often used method. You can also use analogy learning. That's basically, or metaphor learning is also sometimes used. But basically what you then do, you as an example, for instance, playing basketball. If you want to make a jump shot, so that's basically going like this, you can, if you do it in an explicit way, you can say, okay, bend your shoulder, or bend your elbow, bend your wrist, or flex your wrist, etc. And you give all the instructions about how the movement is made. But if you use metaphor learning or analogy learning, you basically say make a gooseneck. So this is supposed to be a gooseneck. So basically what the sporter has to remember is the gooseneck, but doesn't get any information about how to make the gooseneck. Or for instance with a slam dunk in basketball, they say put there's an example, cookie in the jar, and then they place a jar higher up, and then basically that's the only thing they have to do. And it's not only in sports science that works well, because I know also examples of in rehabilitation that they basically, if they want to train people again with, for instance, that have problems with their arms, to extend their arms, you can say, okay, stretch it, bend it, stretch it, but that's a bit more, it's a very explicit way. But sometimes what they do, they have a bookshelf and say to people, okay, can you place this cup there? Or can you place it one higher? And basically, the patient doesn't know that they're training the motor skills, but by saying, well, place it a little bit higher, you're basically training the motor skill. And that works sometimes better, also in terms of motivation, than simply saying, okay, extend, flex and extend. Incidental learning and error-reduced learning is a nice one. That's basically, you can say, you learn somebody a skill, and you make a context in which errors are impossible. For instance, if you want to learn a child to throw balls in a basket or somewhere, you can start by, well, having a child standing here, have a very large basket, and say to the child, okay, throw it in there. It always works, there's always success. And then you gradually increase the size of the basket, and they still throw, and they still, well, you make sure that they don't make errors. And it works perfect for motivation, because the kids, they like it, and it's in a lot of sports skills, it's also very important to get the motivation really high. And it actually works in terms of motor skill learning. So these are all different methods, there's heaps more, but these are some of the methods that are used in implicit learning. And then of course, let's see, it's not here. Okay, so I'll just give the, oh yeah, this is one, but this is what I already told. So this is a very explicit way to learn forehand stroke. So if you learn somebody forehand stroke and you do it like this, position yourself inside the closed baseline, keep your feet on the weight of the shoulders, go on and on. Some instructors do that actually. I've seen physical education classes back home in schools where the teachers basically sit down, or the students sit down and the teacher is explaining for maybe 15 minutes or something. Well, there is something like what is called in psychology the privacy recency effect. So basically, that means that you only remember the first things and the last things. So if you do an instruction like this, you will only remember the first and the last instruction. So this is a very explicit way of doing it, and probably not Okay. So just one example. This is an old one. It's 1992. So that's the one of Rich Masters from Australia. So he did this learning, what I just said with goal cutting, explicit learning with instructions, the implicit learning through non-instruction secondary activity, so basically dual task, and a control group. And what they saw is that this was one of the first studies, experimental studies in implicit motor learning. So the most important thing was that they found was that implicit learning is possible. This is also always nice that it works. And the important thing, what I already alluded to, is that the implicit learning group had best performance, and it's also more robust under pressure. So it's a good way of doing it. And then what we did back home is, because we work a lot with schools, and also with schools for special education. I don't know if that's the same here, but in the Netherlands we have to say mainstream schools, special education schools, which are basically special needs schools, so children with special needs. And we wanted to find out, okay, is there evidence in the literature, in the scientific literature, that implicit learning actually works as a method? Because I have to admit, when I first heard it and learning by doing, I thought, it looked like a little bit like that. I don't know if it works. So what we did, we did a systematic review. Systematic reviews are good to find out. So you basically scan the literature, the scientific literature, and you have a research question. You say, okay, I want to know what articles are there that have proof of my research question. It's a very good way to get sort of the state of the art of your topic. It's also a bit boring to do actually, because you have to read a lot of the articles and stuff. But what we showed was that and that was quite good actually, that the implicit paradigms that were used in schools were as effective as the explicit paradigms. So that's good to know, because then you can also say to schools, so maybe you should learn more via an implicit way. Yes. This is a little bit Dutch. So you don't know Dutch. Oh, you do? Okay, so you can translate it in
everyone
sports.
I don't know.
So David makes sports.
Everyone says it's also.
Yeah. So this is a handbook that we make. I have to tell a little bit more about it. So, like I said, the systematic review showed that implicit learning can be effective. So we wanted to find out in practice. So we went to schools for special education. We made video observation of the physical education classes. We talked to the teachers and we said, okay, how do you instruct these children? And mind you, these were children in special education. So I said before, these children have also working memory problems. So for them, the implicit way of learning might be better than the explicit way of learning. So what we did, we taped it and analyzed it, did all the scoring and all those things, and then we find out that actually in most classes they use explicit methods, and the implicit methods were only very, very small. So then, in collaboration with these school teachers, we said, okay, can't we set up a nice handbook in which we have the explicit methods, but also an counterpart, also an implicit way of learning. And that's where we came up with this handbook. So with all kinds of examples, we also have one, and I can also present that if people are interested. But what we do, we have different physical exercise. We have physical exercises that have been done in an explicit way, but we present the counterpart in English. And this book is now used in special education, in the physical education classes there. And it's still effective. So, and children like it more because it's much more fun to do it, because they enter the classroom and instead of sitting down getting a lot of instruction, the teacher also makes a contact in which learning is possible. So they can do physical activity straight away. Okay, let's see. Okay, then the final part, before we go to the questions. This is not a very large part, but that's on motor control and learning. So I didn't tell you anything about feedback. I said a little bit about, okay, what you can do as a teacher or a trainer in terms of instruction, feedback you want to give, is feedback about the task or is it irrelevant feedback, those kind of things. But there's more to it. So there's different types of feedback, task intrinsic and task augmented feedback. So task intrinsic is basically, let's see, the task intrinsic is basically the feedback you gain from your own system. So if I'm walking here, I visually see that I'm approaching you, but if I walk with my eyes closed, I can still walk because my proprioceptus works. So my muscle spine will send me signals that I'm walking. I won't go too far because it's also tactile. I can feel the floor, and I can hear it. It's really quiet. I can hear myself. So there's a lot of information. There's a lot of information you get from your own sensory system that helps you perform a skill. Sometimes it's funny, the sources of the information sources sort of contradict each other, and you probably have had that also. If you're, for instance, sitting in a train and there's a train next to you, and normally if the train leaves, you can feel it probably secondly because you feel the train moving, but you can also see it visually because you see that you're moving. But sometimes the train next to you is moving the opposite direction, and your train is still. Your train is not moving, and then you see the train next to you moving, and you think, visually I'm moving now, but you don't feel it properly secondly. So that gives a very, some people get really sick from that actually. And that's all processed in the posterior parietal cortex in the brain, where all the information is assembled and sort of fitted with the different sources of information. But that's too much for now to talk about. So this is very important sources of information if you're performing a more skill. The other one is augmented feedback, and I talked a little bit about that with respect to teachers, trainers, etc. And you can have two forms of feedback, and that's one is knowledge of results. So basically, how have you done it? For instance, if you throw a ball and ask it, how many good throws did you do? Also playing basketball, etc. But there's also knowledge of performance, and that's how well did you perform. And that's more about your performance. And these two sources, these are, first if you do sport, you can videotape it, and you get knowledge of performance, then the coach tells you, okay, you have to refine your skill a little bit. Okay, so this is, again, this is really old data, but this is just the basics. So how often do you give knowledge of it? So how often do you give as a teacher, trainer? When we talk about it, it's in rehabilitation, it's also a very hot topic. So how often do you train? How often do you give feedback? And the solution is that nobody knows it because it's very personal. But here you can see that what they did here in this experiment, they practiced an arm positioning task, very simple task, and they gave knowledge of results, so how well did they do it. Each trial, every third trial, and every sixth trial. So they performed all well. But if you look at the retention, then you see that every third or every sixth trial, so not every trial feedback or knowledge of result, people perform better. So you don't want to give knowledge of result every time, because that's for your retention not very good. How much? These are questions that I don't have an answer to, and a lot of trainers, coaches, rehabilitation doctors also don't. But this is very personal. So how much information do you get? How little information do you get? Here you see other types of information, for instance, video information. I don't know if you know the tennis player, he's very old. He wasn't my days. John McEnroe, he's still a reporter, I think. And there's alternative sources of information. This is one way, so basically biofeedback, so if you really this is what sometimes what we see in rehabilitation as well. If you want to sort of readjust the muscle contraction scheme, you can use biofeedback. So people get feedback about the muscle contractions, and based on that, they can really understand. Alrighty, that was what I wanted to tell to.
Thank you so much, Professor Steenbergen. Let's open the Q&A session. Anyone would like to ask questions? Chief.
Thank you, sir, for giving me a chance for asking. I want to ask this on what has been explained. Is this autonomic stage related to procedural memory? If so, I'm wondering, people with amnesia still rely on certain autonomic behaviors such as reading skills and the like. If they forget them, is it easier for them to regain these abilities, or is it the same as for the general people? And I'd like to ask another question, if I may. And I'd also like to ask.
Shall I answer first? I'm not first.
Okay.
Because my work memory is also. So people with amnesia, but obviously the people with amnesia, so their work memory is very different. So you see that their old skills, old skills are more like walking, the skills that they learned when they were young, they can be regained pretty quickly, but the relatively new skills, so skills that they've learned in the last couple of years, that's very difficult. And also, for them to learn new skills is really difficult because of their amnesia, and they tend to forget it. So I think actually, if you want to learn people with amnesia, this is something out of the top of my head, but if you want to learn people with amnesia new skills, I think this way of learning might be a good way to do it, because it doesn't involve so much working memory. So you don't put too much stress on working memory, which is not good anyway. So that might be good. Is that answer to your question?
Maybe another question is. And I'd also like to ask about musician who suffers from severe drug addiction, especially heroin and major depression, to the point where he's forgotten how to play the guitar. And how can substance like that and major depression affect motor skills?
Sorry, can you repeat it?
There's a musician who suffers from drug addiction and major depression, and to the point where he's forgotten how to play a guitar. And how can substance like that and major depression affect motor skills?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, I'm not an expert on drug abuse. That's right. Now, it's really difficult to ask because I don't know exactly what drugs does. Well, I know that drugs, especially smoking joints, I know from in the Netherlands that the drugs affect your memory system. So if that does, then my advice would be that it also affects your motor skill learning. And I don't know if there are. I just don't know if there are. If there is evidence of drug use, sort of continuous drug use on a long term. I presume there will be evidence for that, but then that also will affect it. So it will affect your motor skills. Also, I think drugs is also, but then I get a little bit into the physiology of motor. So it's also the motor units, the firing of your brain, all those kind of things. They will, no doubt they will be affected as well. But the precise effects of that, I just don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Olivia.
First of all, thank you, Professor, for the very insightful lesson. There was one particular slide that caught my attention before, and it was about implicit learning and special ed students, special ed kids. one question that I have is, when conducting the research or when the study was conducted, does implicit learning have any kind of specific? Okay, so with kids with ASD, kids who have ASD, they struggle with taking implicit social cues from other adults or from other people in general. So, do these neurodivergent kids have any specific problems with implicit learning, and are there any kind of specific type of people who are better with explicit learning rather than implicit learning? Thank you.
So children with autism spectrum disorder, I mean, they tend not to interact with you. So I mean, it's a spectrum. So this is just one example. I can imagine that for them it is difficult to do explicit learning, because explicit learning always involves another person instructing you. And if you have difficulties with this interpersonal communication, not picking up the right cues, then I think for them explicit learning might be difficult to do. And then you might think of another form of learning, like implicit learning. For instance, in physical education classes, we've seen that some of these kids, they don't basically, well, we say they don't listen to the teacher, but they have difficulties communicating, interacting, making eye contact, all those kind of things. And then the teacher is well off creating a situation in the physical education room where they basically, like I said with Margot City, if you go in there, people just play. And for instance, if you want to learn children, just an example, to high jump, for example, you can explain to them how you have to run, and then you have to start jumping, you have to do all things with your body. But you can also say, okay, at the end there is something, so just go there and then put a rope in between. And they have to jump anyway, and then go to the next one, and then you gradually increase the height of the rope. And that's basically implicit learning. So basically, you're just asking them, I'll go to the other side of the rope because there's a small reward there,